Hey everyone, we're going to take a look at what it takes to install Couchbase Server using Docker. So actually what we're going to be doing is we're going to be installing several instances of Couchbase Server and then clustering them together on our machine. So we're going to be installing a new node for each Docker container, and then we're going to cluster those nodes together. There are a few assumptions here. So the one assumption is that you already have Docker installed. So as you can see, I am using Ubuntu Linux, and some of you might already know this, but Linux is a little different when it comes to Docker than Windows and Mac. So Windows and Mac actually virtualizes these Docker containers using VirtualBox. It's not the same for Linux, even though that the commands that we use are pretty much the same. Just what happens in the background that we don't see is going to be a little different. With that said, if you are following along with any of these platforms, you should be able to follow along without any issues. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to open up our command prompt or terminal, and we're going to type in the following. We're going to say sudo. You're going to use sudo if you're on a Mac or if you're on a Linux, but we're going to say sudo docker run. We're going to run it in detached mode. We're going to give it a name. Let's go ahead and give this one cb1. And then the image that we're going to download and install is Couchbase. So if you've already got it downloaded like I do, it'll just go ahead and create the new Docker container. Otherwise, it'll go ahead and download it. So it may take a few minutes because the file size is 100 or 200 megabytes in size, but nothing outrageous. So we do have one Docker container up and running. So what we want to do is we want to figure out the IP address of that Docker container. So we can say sudo docker inspect, and then we want to give it the name, so cb1. So as you can see at the bottom of my terminal, it gave me the gateway and the IP address. We only care about the IP address, so go ahead and take that to your web browser and type in the IP address there. 172.17.0.2 for me. And then actually Couchbase operates on port 8091. Perfect. So we do have one Couchbase instance already running now. So what we want to do is let's go ahead and set that up. So we can go through our process here. Let me expand my window. So we're going to make sure that we leave all of the services running. So we want it to be a data index and query node. We're defining the the storage location, the host name, but I do want to lower some of the specs because this is all with Docker on my local machine, and I don't want to allocate all of the resources available. So I'm going to go ahead and limit this to 1024 megabytes of RAM and click next. I do have the opportunity to install a few sample buckets. So these sample buckets include some sample data. If you want to play around with them, it'd be a good idea. So I'm going to go ahead and install the travel sample. The final screen, well, one of the final screens actually, you have to create a default bucket. It defaults to a very large amount of megabytes, but for me, I don't plan to put much in the default bucket, so I'm going to allocate it 100 megabytes. I'm going to leave everything else as default and click next. I'm going to agree to the terms. And then I'm going to enter a password and click next. So this administrator and password, so this username and password, definitely remember it because that's what we're going to use when we start adding items to our cluster. So click next, and there you go. So our first node is being configured right now. So while that's happening, let's go ahead and spin up another Docker container. So I'm going to hit up arrow a few times so that way it saves me some typing. And instead of CB1, I'm going to call this one CB2. There we go. So like last time, what we want to do is we want to run docker inspect, but this time on the new container to get that IP address. So this time the IP address is 03. So we're going to add a new tab here. Let's say 172.17.0.3. We're also going to use the same port, which is 8091. So this is a brand new Couchbase instance. So we're going to go ahead and click setup. This time, instead of starting a new cluster, we're going to join a cluster. We can go ahead and leave everything else the same, but we're going to join a cluster. and we're going to leave the username as administrator because that's what the username was, but we're going to enter our password here. And you can see I made an error. I didn't type in the right IP address. So the IP address that we want to use is the IP address of what we've already set up. So 172.17.0.2. So I pasted that in and I click next. All right, so it just added the second node to our already existing cluster. So at this point in time, I can go ahead and close out of this second tab because it doesn't really matter what IP address we use now because they're both peer-to-peer connected. So we're not done yet. We do need to rebalance this node. So rebalancing will distribute the data across both nodes in the cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and click rebalance. And it depending on how powerful your server is, it could take a little bit of time. As you recall, I didn't give my servers the most amount of resources, so it may be a little slower for me. Perfect, our rebalance is done. So now we have a very functional Couchbase cluster. So the two nodes combined their resources. The data was distributed evenly across those two nodes. And we did all of this with Docker. So if you want to use Docker, it's definitely a very valid solution to use.